In March of 2019, the people of Hong Kong began to peacefully protest an extradition bill that would allow the Chinese government to extradite Hong Kong citizens to the Chinese mainland to face criminal trial. The protests were peaceful, incredibly large, if not absolutely massive, and went on for months. At first, the Chinese government sent their policy enforcers out to intimidate the protesters. When the protests continued, the policy enforcers were told to use tear gas. When protesters found refuge from the brutality of the policy enforcers in shopping malls, the policy enforcers followed them in and continued their assault. But the protests continued. So the Chinese government recruited thugs and gangsters who wore white t-shirts to brutalize the protesters as they traveled on public transit. But the protests continued. So the Chinese government used water cannons with dyed water that allowed the government to identify protesters later on. But the protest continued. And this wasn't the only massive protest that went on for months in the world at the time. In France, Yellow Vest protesters had been protesting since November of 2018. They were protesting a fuel tax, traffic enforcement cameras, which many Western countries have been rolling out, austerity measures, a wealth tax repeal, uncontrolled immigration, which many Western countries have also been rolling out, globalization, which many Western countries have been leaning towards, class conflict, and neoliberalism. Basically, they were protesting the New World Order agenda, and they weren't alone. As you can see by this Wikipedia screenshot, 33 other countries participated in and supported the Yellow Vest protest. Yeah, I know, 33, big deal. Let's try to move on. Protests were actually so popular in 2019, The New Yorker published this article titled, quote, "The Story of 2019, Protest in Every Corner of the Globe." And despite the tyrannical tactics used by many of these governments to shut down these protests, the protests continued to grow and showed little to no sign that they were slowing. And the truth is that these protests were part of a growing protest culture that had been slowly building up in Western countries over the last couple of decades. We can say protests had started to gain popularity again under the Bush administration, died out under the Obama administration, and came back with a vengeance under the Trump administration. Sure, many of the early protests at the start of the Trump administration were erroneous and products of New World Order agents, but even if all the protests were for erroneous causes, the positive thing is that people were going out and engaging each other outside, away from online censors, away from government spying, and away from other weapons of mass distraction, which allowed the truth to penetrate some echo chambers. And a positive thing that came out of these more mindless protests were encouraging others to have more meaningful protests, like this pro-gun rally that took place in Los Angeles. However, after many months, and after trying every tactic in the book to shut down these protests in Hong Kong, France, and elsewhere in the world, the powers that shouldn't be finally found a way to track protesters and even totally shut down protest, despite protesting being considered an inalienable human right in many of these Western countries. And that thing these governments found was a good health scare, which people had been conditioned to respond to in a certain way by Hollywood movies and previous health scares like the Ebola health scare the bird flu health scare, and the SARS health scare. And in March of 2020, the Hong Kong protest, Yellow Vest protest, and any other meaningful protest against the New World Order agenda was ended using coronavirus lockdown measures. Here's one article titled, "Under Cover of Coronavirus, Hong Kong Cracks Down on Protest Movement." And another article from Amnesty International that is quoted saying, quote, "Peaceful protests have been banned under draconian COVID-19 powers, and hundreds of protesters fined." Not only were these protests crushed using coronavirus lockdown measures, but we know that now the government can use increases in COVID cases as an excuse to continue to trample on our inalienable God-given right to protest for years, if not decades, to come, like they are already doing in Australia. The worst part is that now many people who might have been on the fence when it comes to protesting will probably be too afraid of getting sick to go out and protest, especially the younger generation. These young children, 6 years and younger, who are being forced to wear masks. Think about the mentality that these children will develop when it comes to going outside, being around people, and even questioning the government. So, what is the answer? Stop protesting and start really organizing. You have to understand the history of how this country was fought for. You have to understand how our founding fathers went from carrying out protests like the Boston Tea Party to establishing committees of correspondence to holding the First Continental Congress. So what I'm suggesting is that we begin creating committees of correspondence that are away from online censors and government spying, to discuss real solutions about how to deal with what is obviously rogue governments who are clearly abusing the power granted to them by our ancestors.